Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to Keeping an Eye on the Geopolitical Ball. As always, with me, Jamie Shea, Senior Fellow at Friends of Europe. Periodically, I'm involved in a dialogue between a group of retired Western diplomats and a group of think tankers in China, basically from Beijing and Shanghai. And at a time when obviously relations between China and the global democracies are deteriorating, it strikes us as probably a good thing to have a channel of communication open on what diplomats call track 2. And secondly, to hear the Chinese view, to understand better how they see the world from east looking west. And just a couple of weeks ago, we had our latest dialogue, and it was clear to we former Western diplomats that the Chinese think tankers clearly see that over the last 18 months, relations have deteriorated sharply and perhaps also definitively. They see the West taking more prominent sanctions against Chinese officials, for example, over the treatment of the Uyghur minority. They've seen the way in which more European countries, and not just the United States, are sending ships to the South China Sea and the Indo-Pacific and conducting freedom of navigation activities. They've seen how the United States is increasing its support to Taiwan. They've seen the limits that the European Union and other countries are now putting on Chinese foreign direct investment and scrutinizing Chinese control of critical infrastructure and supply chains. And what they've noted is that many foreign ministers who normally would never dare criticize China publicly because their countries do too much trade with Beijing, that those foreign ministers, like the German foreign minister Heiko Maas just a couple of days ago, are now much more willing to say critical things about Chinese behavior in public. Now, when authoritarian countries are criticized, they have a well-established playbook of responding. Firstly, deny reality. For example, that the Uyghur camps don't really exist or are purely humanitarian re-education centers. Secondly, point the finger at the imperfections, and they are real and many, of the Western democracies. For example, polarization, or the way in which the Black Lives Matter campaign has surged over the last year, or the riots in the US Capitol. So how dare you criticize us when your own systems are not working very well? They tend to overreact, and China has reacted to the relatively mild sanctions against Chinese officials by imposing even harsher sanctions on American congressmen or members of the European Parliament. And they develop often a very arrogant narrative of the superiority of the authoritarian system over the democratic system, which means that if they're on the winning side of history, they have every right to be assertive. Now, defiance, of course, in international relations is always a very convenient stance to take. You can play the victim. You can stir up domestic nationalism at home by pointing to foreign threats and foreign bullying. You can fit back into your comfortable black and white world. Why negotiate with your adversaries when they are so inflexible in the way that they treat you? And finally, you can adopt a kind of passive stance of waiting for your adversary to seize the olive branch first. But in the dialogue a couple of weeks ago with our Chinese experts, we wanted to sort of get out of that black and white syndrome of confrontation and map out some areas where China could engage the West more productively if it wished so. And we came up with 5, which I would like to share with you today. Number 1, that China could be more cooperative on Afghanistan, particularly as the NATO and US forces withdraw. China could support financially the Afghan National Army, its Air Force. It could help with training, particularly with the police. It has major economic investments in Afghanistan, particularly in the iron net copper mines, and could use its One Belt, One Road initiative to help build Afghanistan's infrastructure, particularly linking to ports in Pakistan like Karachi and Gwadar. It could play a bigger role in the regional diplomacy of bringing the Taliban and the Afghan government around the table. Number 2, non-proliferation. We have the NPT, the Non-Proliferation Treaty Review Conference, coming up in New York later this year. The Chinese could work with the Western countries to make sure that we continue to have firm controls and firm sanctions on countries that violate that treaty. It could help put more pressure on North Korea to stop conducting provocative missile tests. It could work with the West to get Iran back into the joint comprehensive plan of action. And it could send a signal to the United States and Russia that, yes, it is willing to join a continuation of the START strategic nuclear talks process. As it builds up its nuclear weapons, it has less of an excuse not to become part of those global nuclear reduction talks. The third thing it could do would be to establish a military-to-military dialogue with NATO. Notwithstanding the freeze in NATO-Russia relations at the moment, the NATO commanders still meet with the Russian commanders, the Russian Chief of Defense Gerasimov, from time to time to establish a hotline so that they can understand each other's threat perception, so that they can deal with crises and prevent incidents. And as the NATO and Chinese forces modernize, having that hotline between their supreme commands, like with Russia, makes eminent sense. China could also, number 4, work with us on space. China is now a space power. This week it landed its own probe on Mars, but clearly it has, like the West, an interest in preventing the militarization of space through things like anti-satellite weapons or weapons in space, and modernizing the UN Treaty on Outer Space, which dates back to the 60s, so that we put curbs on introducing dangerous technologies or weapons in outer space and keep it a domain for everybody. And then finally, climate change. The Chinese really have been more cooperative with the West on climate change. And as NATO takes up this issue and looks at how it can green its militaries and get them more involved in dealing with climate change scenarios like natural disasters, then of course a dialogue with the Chinese military in this area where we are both equally affected makes sense as well. Now, in conclusion, I don't think that on some issues like the US supporting Taiwan or sailing ships in the Straits of Taiwan, or the Chinese when it comes to the Uyghurs, I don't think on some issues we're likely to see much give and take. But there is a middle ground of more imaginative ideas which strike me as realistic for both sides. So it's up to Beijing not simply to criticize us, that's easy, but to answer the much more difficult question, is it really ready to work with us? Thank you very much for watching and listening. As always, a pleasure. See you next week.